Hello there, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk to you about a really exciting and marvelous new disc of orchestral works by American composer Harold Shapero. And here it is. It's performed by the Boston Modern Orchestra Project under its music director, Gil Rose. Now, we need to talk a little bit about Harold Shapero because you may not know who he is, but you should. He is a sensational composer, was a sensational composer. He passed away in 2013. He was one of the American neoclassicists, but sort of a neoclassicist on steroids. He really, really admired Stravinsky, and he composed a very, very interesting and personal body of music, all of which is based on earlier models in one way or another. It was a thing with him. He needed that kind of inspiration. But of course, the point about working with a model, as Stravinsky showed us, for example, is that it doesn't matter what your model is as long as you can do something that's just as good. Because everybody has models. All composers have models. The idea that music has to be invented or reinvented from whole cloth every time a composer does something is ridiculous. It's an affectation of the modern avant-garde, which like to pretend that they were doing things that had never been done before with music. And sometimes they did. Most of the time they didn't. But all of the composers who we love and pride in their originality, people like Berg and Schoenberg or Mahler or Stravinsky or even Bartók, they worked with traditional media, they worked with traditional forms, they were inspired by earlier music, they took earlier music as models. Shapero did that, and he was simply more obvious than a lot of other people. His career as a composer was a somewhat sad one, in like so many. You remember my talk about Einar Englund, the Finnish composer. There were so many excellent composers who were sidelined in the 60s and 70s because of the triumph of academic serialism, which disdained anyone who wrote music that was tonal, anybody who wrote music in traditional forms, anybody who didn't follow the party line. It was a horrible, horrible time for musicians, and it affected Shapero because Shapero started his career going like gangbusters in the 1940s with works such as the Symphony for Classical Orchestra, which is overwhelmingly based on Beethoven's 5th and 7th symphonies. It takes the orchestration of Beethoven's 5th and the model of sort of Beethoven's 7th and applies it with gusto to a completely modern and fresh sounding piece. I mean, it's really fascinating because you know what the model is, even if you can tell, or even as you hear how different what Shapero is doing is. In other words, if you know the model, then it enriches your experience of the piece. But if you don't know the model, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference because the music, of course, is absolutely marvelous by itself. Now, Shapero essentially stopped composing during those decades in the late 20th century because his music was spat upon. It was disdained. It was regarded as regressive and unoriginal. And, it's such a tragedy because we who listen, critics particularly, ought to be able to distinguish good music from bad music of its kind. And that's it. And history will judge the rest of it. But in any case, the Symphony for Classical Orchestra was picked up by Andre Previn and the Boston Symphony. It performed around, and I saw it in Carnegie Hall. And they recorded the thing for New World Records. Here is that recording. It's a fine recording. It's a live recording. There are, the usual sort of slight raggedness that you hear in some live recordings, but it revived interest in Shapero. And I saw them do this at Carnegie Hall, and it was a splendid concert of an incredibly beautiful, wonderful work. Shapero had this sort of gosh gee whiz attitude towards Stravinsky and music generally that gives his music a freshness and an innocence and a sweetness It's not, I'm talking about cloying or sentimental. It's nothing like that. But there's this sort of wide-eyed wonder at the fun of making music in his works that's really, really evident. And I kind of got that sense. I met him and spoke to him a few times after this came out because I became very interested in his work. And when I talked to him, he told me, I said to him, he hasn't written very much. And he explained to me how he'd sort of given it up and was sick of it. But also what bothered him was that, his music is extremely intricate rhythmically. It's very, very difficult technically to play. And he was finding that orchestras and ensembles just weren't playing it very well. They needed more rehearsal time. They needed to give it more attention. They needed to take it more seriously. And so he wasn't so keen on writing more music. And it's just 1,000 pities because who knows what else he could have done. But we do have, a couple of dozen, a few more pieces of music, including a nice little body of orchestral music and a string quartet and a string trio and a bunch of piano sonatas and a two-hand piano sonata, which are marvelous, marvelous pieces, and these orchestral pieces. But after the Previn came out, people began to remember, believe it or not, that the Symphony for Classical Orchestra was originally recorded by none other than Leonard Bernstein in his very, very early days with the Columbia Symphony. It's on this disc. It was recorded in mono. And I just want to play you a little sample of it because I now have permission from Sony Classical to use sound samples in these talks. I'm very excited about that. So I want to play you just a tiny bit of the finale, and you'll just get a sense of the fun, the driving energy, you might say, oh, gee, it sounds sort of like Stravinsky, sort of, maybe, kind of, but not really. There's just a brightness and freshness to the music that's just entirely special in my view. And we're going to hear more of that when we hear samples of this new recording from the Boston Modern Orchestra project, which I had backwards on the booklet there. There you go. That's it. So let's listen to a bit of the finale of the Symphony for Classical Orchestra, just 30 seconds. It says you get a sense of what he was about in this, his sort of first great masterpiece. Fun, huh? I mean, it really is. It's just fun, and it's a big work. It's a big, serious symphony. One of the great, great American symphonies, and barely known. It's really a shame. It's a terrible shame. And if you have a chance, and you can get either the Bernstein or the Previn recordings, you really should hear the Symphony for Classical Orchestra. But in the meantime, the Boston Modern Orchestra project, as I said, we'll get to business here, issued this extraordinary disc. Let me get my finger out of the way and do it this way so you can see what's on it. I mean, it consists of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 works. 5 works, and they're not minor works. They're fascinating works. The first thing that's on the disc is the Sinfonia in C minor from 1948. This is a single movement piece that has sort of alternating sections that kind of lay side by side. And I want to play you a little bit of it because one of the things it shows you, and I think does it so marvelously, is just how Shapero was able to use conventional instruments, conventional orchestration to achieve really rather new and shiny and bright instrumental effects. Listen to this. Listen to this passage. mean, it makes kind of a fascinating sound, doesn't it? There's a sense in his orchestration. His orchestration is very bright. His mean sonority, is high pitched. It tends to be high pitched. It's like he took one of those yellow highlighters and sort of illuminated all of the melodic lines in his music. His rhythms are sharp and his sonorities are sharp. Also, it has to do with how he uses woodwind instruments and strings and the balance in the ensemble. But you hear it very clearly in that excerpt from this wonderful little Sinfonia in C minor. Next on the disc is a slow piece called Credo for Orchestra from 1955. This is just a piece of quiet hymn-like music, which didn't strike me as all that interesting, frankly. It's about 8 minutes long, and it's not a big deal. However, the next piece, the Partita in C for piano and small orchestra. This is a knockout. The soloist, the piano soloist here is Vivian Choi, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 movements. The movements are Sinfonia, Giacona, which is a Passacaglia, Chaconne, Pastoral, Scherzo, Aria, Burlesca, Cadenza, and Esercizio. And I'm going to play you a bit of the Burlesca because, as you will hear, Shapero had a sense of humor, which is just one of the most redeeming qualities in a composer, particularly a modern composer. Here, take a listen to a little bit of the Burlesca from the Partita in C. Tremendous, huh? Just delightful. Absolutely delightful. It's a wonderful, wonderful work. Next, we get On Green Mountain. This is for jazz ensemble. This, in some ways, is one of the most fascinating works on the disc because On Green Mountain, if you translate Green Mountain into Italian, you get Monteverdi. Get it? Monteverdi. That's the guy. What he's done here, Shapero has done, is taken a Monteverdi madrigal, actually from book 6 of his madrigals, and turned it into a jazz combo piece. And I was going to play you the Monteverdi madrigal and then some of this, but it's okay. You'll get the point when you hear it because you'll just listen to it as a jazz piece. But it's all based on this Monteverdi madrigal. It's fabulous. It's absolutely fabulous. And last but not least comes another one of his really major masterpieces from the same period as the Symphony for Classical Orchestra from 1945. This is his Serenade in D for String Orchestra. Now, this was a problematic work because it is absolutely wonderful. It's in 5 movements. It's one of the great 20th century string orchestra works. If he'd been British, we would have been reading in Gramophone about, another in the lovely long list of masterworks for string ensemble to go with, Britten's Frank Bridge Variations and Tippett's Concerto for Double String Orchestra and the Vaughan Williams Tallis Fantasia. You know what I mean. It's a great piece for string orchestra. Nobody does it. Why? Because of its difficulty. And because of that difficulty, Shapero later arranged it for string quartet because he figured that way he could get a decent rhythmically accurate performance about it. And that's what we were talking about. He wanted, when I spoke to him, to hear a really good performance of the Serenade done in its original string orchestra version. And this is it. It's here. It has arrived. Unfortunately, he's gone, but at least the performance is with us. However, the string quartet version was recorded on New World Records by the Lydian String Quartet. Is that who this is? I think it is. Yes, the Lydian String Quartet, quite excellently. And I'm going to play you a comparison of the two bits of the same music, just so that you can get a sense. First, we're going to listen for the string quartet version of the Intermezzo, which is just a little andantino con moto. And you even hear, though, in this sort of slow, easy piece, you can hear just how rhythmically intricate the ensemble writing is. It's really quite fascinating. It keeps your ear buzzing the whole time. So let's listen to a bit of the intermezzo with the Lydian String Quartet from the Serenade in D. And now let's listen to the same music performed in its original version for the full string orchestra is done by the Boston Modern Orchestra Project under Gil Rose. Interesting, isn't it? It's quite a difference, I think, although you can hear how, what the string quartet can execute with comparative clarity obviously takes more work for the full string ensemble. But on the other hand, the full string version, I think, has a warmth and a charm and that intermezzo-like relaxed character that you don't hear so much in the sort of more abrupt and angular string quartet version. Either way, it's a masterpiece. It's an amazing, amazing piece of music. And so I really hope that if you have a chance, you'll pick up this disc, first of all, because the Boston Modern Orchestra Project is a great ensemble that deserves your support and your attention. And second of all, because Harold Shapero is a brilliant, brilliant composer. I'm going to stick this up here again so you can see it and see it carefully. And it's so worth your time and attention getting to know this music. You'll encounter a truly special personality who really does some thoughtful and thoughtful, I was going to say, original things with old music, who really redefines, in a sense, what it means to be an original voice in music, because Shapero was. He was a very original voice in music, even if everything he wrote is somehow evocative of something else. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And yet, one more reason, as I always say, to keep on listening to Harold Shapero, an American maverick in his way, and a wonderfully fresh and delightful voice in 20th century music. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed this little review. Get listening, folks.